First responders. What is the worst injury you've seen that was caused by the stupidest and easiest to avoid event? I was a firefighter and we were called to vehicle fire at midnight in a rural area. We got there and sure enough, there was a pickup truck fully engulfed. This wasn't the usual engine compartment fire. The whole truck was roaring. I was the nozzle man at the time in my engine, which meant my job was to be the guy spraying water on the fire. As I got closer to the pickup, I noticed a god-awful smell. It was relatively new, so I couldn't place it, but I just knew it was putrid. My heart immediately sank when I remembered there was a missing girl case in our area. People often stash evidence inside cars and burn the whole thing to get rid of the evidence. As I'm putting out the fire, I'm dreading what I'll find. Something was in the truck bed. The fact that the truck's owner wasn't on the scene made me more nervous. Fast forward and the fire's out. It turns out the truck bed was filled with dozens of pumpkins. Thankfully, there were no bodies, but we had no idea where the driver was. A few days later, we heard from the cops that just before we arrived at the fire, a lone guy showed up at the ER. It turns out that as this guy was driving his pumpkins to a nearby farmer's market, he hit something in the road. His gas gauge went to empty and he smelled gas coming from his truck. The hero of the story crawled under his truck to assess the damage and used the only light source he had, a Bic lighter. Someone saw the fire and drove him to the ER. A separate passerby was the one who actually called in the fire. Halloween came early with horrific pumpkin smells, a combustion, and an injured driver. Hate to be this firefighter at midnight. Story 2. A theater was being renovated. The theater was designed for a specific show, and that show left after something like a 15-year run. One of the design quirks of the theater was a concrete basement underneath the stage, where machinery would push up some pretty impressive set changes from below. This meant the stage had giant open holes in it after all the machinery and stuff was cleared out of the basement. The holes in the stage opened up to a 30-foot drop with bare concrete beneath. The crew who was tearing down the stuff on the stage took some precautions to make sure nobody fell into those holes. They put plywood over the holes and set up caution cones all around them. When they finished tearing down all the stuff on the stage, the last thing remaining were those cones and plywood. Someone picked up all the cones and it was our future patient's job to pick up the plywood. These were long sheets of plywood, too big to just throw over his shoulder, so he just picked up one side of the plywood sheet and started walking forward, pushing it along the stage floor. He never even saw the hole he fell through because the plywood he was pushing blocked his view of his own feet. He fell 30 feet and tumbled on the way down, landing directly on his outstretched hands. He had multiple nasty compound fractures in both arms. Luckily, it just knocked him unconscious with a few injuries. Nothing unfixable. The radial or ulnar fractures were the worst, though. He woke up while we were prepping him for ambulance transport. He mumbled something to us, but his speech was garbled, mostly due to his injury, but also due to the spinal immobilization we put on him, which tucks underneath the chin. He kept mumbling, "Ma." After a while, I realized he was trying to tell us that his hands hurt, which makes sense, considering the circumstances. Story 3. I'm a cop. At about 4:45 in the morning, we get a call about a burglary in progress. Now we get off at 6:30 and have a whole night of paper to do right before we go home, so we weren't exactly stoked to do this. Anyway, I get there first and the two occupants come running out and say a dude was trying to break in and smashed a window to do it, so they ran. I'm thinking active burglary is in progress, so I get my buddy rolling code 3 in case this turns sideways. We get the house around it and decide, well, whatever. We have to approach somehow. Look through the fence and see what looks like a person lying on the ground. We make entry into the backyard and sure enough, a person is lying on the ground right by the rear door. Only now can we also see shattered glass and the color red everywhere. We push into the backyard and the guy is clearly lifeless. Medics on the scene confirmed it. After further inspection, we realized that this clown had broken the window and hurt his arm badly. He then walked from that location to the rear door and tried to enter there for a long time. He ended up passing away right by the door. The homeowners had no idea who he was. I ended up going home before the whole thing was wrapped up and I never got confirmation on anything, but our best guess was that this knucklehead was so big that he thought this house was his and ended up smashing the window trying to get in when he couldn't open the door, hurt himself and just went belly up. Story 4. I've got one about a hammer driver, which is incredibly stupid to me, but this dude is pretty bad off. He was driving on a major road through my hometown and I happened to be walking to a Taco Bell around 9 p.m., so I kind of saw how it happened, with a man in a large pickup truck going about 120 on this road and slamming into the back of a stopped SUV, who then in turn went spiraling from the force into someone driving on the opposite side of the road. The truck didn't stop, but somehow managed to turn 180 and go in the opposite direction. It drove this time into a ditch and crashed into a telephone pole. I don't really know which one to go for first, so I chose the truck. When I ran over and opened the driver's side door, the guy was barely conscious and was badly injured. The airbag didn't deploy, and when I got him to speak to me, I noticed he had no teeth left. I ended up pulling him out of the car and setting him upright, using his phone to call the police and then his wife, per his request. I was young at the time with no phone of my own. Upon re-inspecting the car, I noticed all of the booze spread out. I could kind of catch it on his breath, but I was taken aback by everything, I guess. I didn't really stick around too much longer after the fire department and professionals got there, but I heard of it in the news later on. No one else was hurt to my knowledge, other than the guy. It was a real miracle. as the SUV had a baby on board sign from what I remember. No matter what, never drink and drive. Story 5. My mother was a police explorer in the 1980s. She later went on to become a 911 dispatcher. She had to do a ride-along as part of police explorers or dispatch training. I can't remember. The town she lived in has lots of gravel roads. On a blistering and muggy Iowa summer day, the ambulance gets called to the motorcycle crash. They were speeding down the gravel, and he was wearing shorts, sandals, and no helmet. He had massive head injuries, and the smell is something my mom says she can still smell when she tells this story. It didn't help that it was super humid, too. The girl riding with him had it way worse. She passed away in the hospital before her parents got there. My mom made me swear to never ride motorcycles. Riding leather isn't a fashion statement, so unless you want to force some traumatized 20-year-old to get you off the road, wear the proper riding gear and helmet. Story 6. I was not an EMT or anything, but I was first on the scene of a double accident as it was occurring. A pickup truck tried to avoid a car it pulled out in front of. The truck flipped several times. The first thing I noticed as it was flipping, which clued me into the accident occurring, the car veered to the right of the road. The car hit a flatbed construction truck that happened to be parked off the road. After making sure the guy in the truck was okay, he was super disoriented, I sat him down in a safe area. I ran over to the car that collided with the flatbed and had ignited at this point, and the engine was burning. The steering wheel had been forced down, which injured the passenger's legs. I was pretty sure the car wouldn't explode, and I was already on the phone with an emergency hotline. I didn't want to move her, as it could have hurt her even more. Luckily, the next person on the scene just happened to be a paramedic driving by. He helped me with everything, and I left after giving a brief description of the accident to the police. I still have no idea if the woman lived, but it isn't likely she did. To this day, that injury is the most gruesome thing I've ever witnessed. Wish there were more awesome civilians like this around. Story 7. Obligatory not a first responder. My brother was hanging out with our cousin on his birthday. My brother decided to make a quick run to the store for some ice cream. He got on his motorcycle and decided not to wear any gear since it was just a few blocks away. You can see where this is going. He lived in St. George, Utah at the time. A popular activity there is sand duning. Part of doing that is lowering the air pressure in the tires. The motorcycle he took had tires like this. He was going downhill when the motorcycle flipped forward, launching him forward. Luckily, he was thinking quickly enough to cover his head with his arms. His forearms got road rash, and he landed on his knee but only had a couple of scratches on his head. A passerby saw it and called an ambulance. And luckily, one was nearby, so he didn't have to wait long. To this day, he has big pink patches on his arms and his right knee is a little weaker than the other. The moral of the story is that, even if it's just a couple blocks in town, always wear proper gear. Also check the air pressure on your tires all the time. Story 8. EMT here. I have 2 that stand out. 1, I was called for a motorcycle crash. I got on the scene and the guy tried to jump right over the traffic circle. Long story short, he got the helicopter express to our trauma center. Number 2, it was the middle of winter and we had a good 2 feet of snow on the ground. Guy decides some tree branches need to come down before they fall. He asked his neighbor for help and the neighbor was taller and also had a solid 270 pounds of muscle. He was a cop. So he was on the ladder trimming the branches. Well, this tree was on an awkward hill and the ladder wouldn't lean right. These idiots decide that the best way is for the guy to stand with a log behind him so he doesn't slip and to hold the ladder straight up for the neighbor. The neighbor fell on top of the guy who fell backward and injured his back. The guy got an emergency spinal fusion. Another is the story of a paramedic I used to work with. One morning, a kid in a motorcycle decided to do upwards of 80 miles per hour on a super windy, hilly road that goes through woods and always has deer in the middle of it. The road was wet because it had just rained overnight. The kid crested a hill with deer in the road and he couldn't stop in time. The deer passed away while the kid flew about 150 feet. The kid managed to live, barely. It was in trauma arrest. The medic was doing compressions for a solid 15 minutes before a trooper got there. Luckily, this kid crashed right in front of the firehouse. Story 9. I responded to a motor vehicle collision around 3 on a super humid summer night as a firefighter or first responder. As we were en route, dispatch patched in more information saying that it was a motorcycle versus 18-wheeler accident. Adrenaline starts pumping and nerves start racking. I arrived in the scene with debris all over the interstate, with the ALS ambulance a short distance behind us. It was around 6 miles further when we were paged, and flight medics around 15 minutes out. We bandaged and gauze wounds while also hooking the patient to O2. Investigation revealed that his bike was traveling at an extremely high rate of speed. The speedometer was stuck at 122, though I do not think it was that high. The patient recovered almost completely within 2 months. The moral of the story? No matter what vehicle you're in, be safe, observant of your surroundings, and slow down. Wherever you're going, it will be there when you get there. And if you're looking for the adrenaline rush, well, I'd rather not have one at all than have one from being in a major accident. Story 10. Not a first responder, but I was working as a receptionist in the hospital's X-ray department. Paramedics brought up someone in a stretcher fresh from the ambulance. This guy was groggy, left his group, and hugged a truck. He was baked, and somehow had not really realized what had happened to him. So the paramedics, one radiographer, and I had to don the lead aprons and hold this guy down while the other radiographer basically took a full set. He was badly hurt without passing away on the spot, but he was so far off that he still tried to move. He must have been in a very happy place not to notice it. So A, don't take illegal stuff, and B, if you do, stay off the freaking street. Story 11. 25 years in fire service. Choose one. A. Accidentally dropping a personal item into your bed and suffering burns, affecting your skin and causing significant damage. B. Driving under the influence and colliding with a tree in your vehicle so forcefully that the frame rails are connected on the other side. Unfortunately, not being identified for 4 days due to having false identification. C. Pulling over your car on the side of I-95 to relieve yourself at 2 a.m., exiting on the traffic side and encountering a hazardous situation with a passing truck. Dealing with irresponsible drivers is frustrating. Imagine waking up at 1 a.m., spending 5 hours observing law enforcement's investigation, and then going to work with only 2 hours of sleep. Here's a recent incident I didn't have to handle directly within the last year. An individual entered traffic for a tragic reason at 5 a.m. on I-95 in Greenwich, CT. The truck driver was unaware of the person crossing, and traffic unintentionally continued passing over him until 9 a.m. I examined the scene around 6:30 a.m. and noticed scattered clothing. The rush hour traffic from New York City went over that area for 4 hours, complicating the situation. I bet you're thanking your lucky stars that you're not one of these people. But before we dive in for more disturbing accounts, hit the like and subscribe button so you won't miss what's coming next. Story 12. There was an SUV full of young adults driving down the highway in busy traffic. They were driving assertively. They attempted to pass a truck, but the truck was towing a trailer and couldn't slow down quickly enough to let them pass before oncoming traffic got close. So they slowed down and attempted to make a second pass. The person in the backseat decided to engage in some inappropriate behavior. Once they passed, they made a sudden maneuver and overturned. The person was thrown out and suffered severe injuries. Story 13. I'm a paramedic. I saw a woman very messed up due to her lack of wearing a helmet in a job site. A large metal beam accidentally fell. She ended up with a significant break in one leg. She was disoriented and experienced memory loss issues while I was assisting her. She would forget things every 5 or so minutes and sometimes wanted to remove the support from her leg during those moments. Pretty crazy. Story 14. I was at work, sitting there with my boss. This guy comes running into our office and cries for help, talking about his friend standing outside. We walk out and see another young man holding his hand, in need of medical attention. We, of course, assist him using a first aid kit, and luckily, my boss is well versed in first aid. He's then transported for further medical care. But the interesting thing is how he got his injury. Apparently, the guys were having a barbecue and he used a circular saw to cut open their buns. They did this so often it never went wrong. Later, I learned that they were able to save at least one of his fingers. Now that's the most overkill way to open a bun I've ever heard. Story 15. The worst injury I've seen caused by something stupid was a man who crashed into a tree on the side of the highway. He had a nice gouge in his scalp and totaled his car. The reason he did this? He imagined the exit was about half a mile earlier than it was and tried to merge off, onto the grass. He was also hopped up on whippets. Really strange to find an entire box of NO2 canisters in someone's passenger seat and an empty whipped cream dispenser, which is the stupidest substance I can think of besides huffing paint. And here I am thinking that eating paste was wild during preschool. Story 16. Obligatory, not a first responder, but my dad was in the 1970s. One of the stories he told me was that he was called to an early morning accident in the 101 where a driver under the influence got on an off-ramp and hit another car head-on. Both the driver and the passenger in the right-of-way car weren't wearing their seatbelts. The driver ended up getting seriously hurt near the steering wheel, and the passenger was thrown through the windshield. Both were unconscious at the scene. As for the impaired driver, surprisingly unharmed because of being so intoxicated, he essentially went limp upon impact. Story 17. I responded to a young guy who fell out of the shower when he slipped. He accidentally hit a wooden toilet plunger against the side of his chest underneath his armpit. The dude was standing in the living room when we got there, plunger and all. How he was alive, I did not know. Our mouths were open after going into the room. I had to put him sideways in the stretcher in a position of comfort. The poor guy was just showering. Story 18. My dad is a police officer, and in the first few weeks he was working, he had 2 really bad accident calls. The first one was on a local highway where a guy had lost control of his U-Haul and overturned. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was thrown out. He landed, most likely already in a critical condition, and the truck came to rest near him. This other one is more gruesome. A homeless man was sleeping under garbage when a garbage truck drove toward him, trying to get closer to the dumpster. I know this has been said many times, I think even in Deadpool, so if you watch that movie, you know the toothpaste analogy. Story 19. My cousin is an EMT. He said one of the nastiest scenes he came upon was a car accident in which the passenger had her legs up on the dash. The airbags deployed, causing some injuries to her ankles and knees. He mentioned she was fully aware when he arrived and was in significant discomfort. If I recall correctly, she survived and was anticipated to have a complete recovery. He has many intense stories, mainly involving challenging situations with substances and impaired drivers. Story 20. Not my story, but one that my paramedic dad has told me a couple of times. The lady was standing under a massive oak tree in her yard after a nasty storm had damaged it. One of the limbs, as thick as the trunk of a normal street tree, was cracked, and this lady was just staring up at it trying to figure out what to do when it broke off and fell on her. Apparently, it had a significant impact on her torso and head, but left her limbs unharmed. According to my dad, it resembled a scene from a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Like Wile E. Coyote when he gets accordioned by an anvil. Story 21. EMS supervisor of a well-known party campus. Of all the calls with thoroughly intoxicated patients, the standout is a freshman who had a single drink and tried to slide down the railing of his fourth-floor dorm stairwell, only to have a fall of 5 stories upside down onto the basement floor. On arrival, what I saw gave me no hope, and I reached down to check his pulse. To my surprise, he not only survived his ICU hospitalization, he sat next to me on the first day of organic chemistry a year later. Story 22. I was at a pride parade. Technically, I was off duty, but I helped the kid anyway. They had experienced some health issues because they took a whole lot of questionable substances. The health issue wasn't the concerning part, though. They were walking around without a shirt and fell onto the pavement, having some movements from the health issue, resulting in cuts. It just demonstrates that it's never appropriate to be without a shirt in public. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy these shocking tales. If you're up for more bizarre aftermaths, you'll enjoy People Who Clean Up Crime Scenes. What was your craziest experience? Story 4 is insane. See you there.